While you were out feeding this morning, China slammed the door on Australian beef. Not locked gradually, over time, or negotiated away in consultation. Slammed it shut, locked it tight. A 55% tariff is now active on everything shipped above their quota. The quota they set was deliberately, strategically tight. We have already blown past it. Over $1 billion in annual trade just disappeared. The Australian government issued an official statement calling it disappointing. That is the language they use in Parliament. Disappointing. That is the word for when a market you spent 20 years building, investing in, believing in with every choice you made, suddenly vanishes overnight. You will not see this story on the evening news. The evening news does not cover slow-motion economic assassinations of entire export industries. But by tomorrow morning, when the processor calls, when they tell you the buying schedule has changed, when they explain that export demand has shifted and prices have adjusted downward, you will understand exactly what just happened to your operation. The era you built your life around is gone. This is not about market cycles. This is not about global headwinds. This is about deliberate choice made by governments protecting their own interests at your expense. Beijing made one. Washington is making another. Seoul already made one back in July. And every decision cascades directly down to you, your cattle, your herd, your financing, your future. Let me walk you through what happened with precision and timeline. In December 2025, just days before Christmas, China formally announced a new quota system for beef imports targeting all major international producers, including Australia, Brazil, Argentina, and New Zealand. On the surface, it sounded like standard trade policy language. In reality, it was a trap engineered with surgical precision. They set an annual quota for beef imported from Australia at precisely 205,000 tons for 2026. Let me make you understand what that number actually means, because the number is the entire weapon. Australia exported 216,000 tons to China in 2024 alone. The year before that, volumes ran even higher, pushing past 295,000 tons. So Beijing took your historical market, took the volumes you were already reliably shipping every single year, set the new quota below what you were already exporting, and then added a 55% tariff on every kilogram above that line. 3 days after the threshold is exceeded, the tariff activates automatically. No negotiation, no discussion, no grace period. You want to understand how fast that threshold disappeared? By May 2026, not even 6 months later, Beijing announced that Australia had already hit 80% of the annual quota. The tariff was expected within weeks. By late June 2026, the quota was exhausted. The 55% tariff became active. Every kilogram of Australian beef heading to China was now 55% more expensive. Before any consumer saw it, before anyone could adjust. The Australian government response tells you everything you need to know. Don Farrell, the trade minister, issued statements saying the country was disappointed by the decision and expected China to respect Australia's free trade agreement status. Disappointed. That is what Parliament calls it when $1 billion in trade disappears. You do not use the word crisis. You do not describe it as an economic attack. You do not say, Australia is being systematically squeezed out of its largest Asian beef market by deliberate policy, and there is nothing anyone in Canberra is going to do that actually matters. Beijing explained the tariff is necessary to protect local farmers and businesses. China is drowning in oversupply. Their domestic beef producers face collapsing margins and angry voices in rural provinces demanding government protection. So the answer is simple. Shut the door on imports and force the local market back toward Chinese beef. Protect Chinese farmers. The irony would be funny if this was not happening to you. Beijing chooses winners and losers. Beijing chooses to protect China. Australia does not get a vote. When you need a market more than that, market needs you, the market wins every time. But here's where it gets darker. China is not the only door slamming shut. This is the opening move in a much larger pattern repeating across every major market. And once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. The United States is rebuilding its herd from 70-year lows. That means American production will climb. When American beef comes back online in significant volumes, the global market architecture shifts fundamentally. Suddenly, Australia is not the only exporter with surplus supply. You are competing in a tighter market against producers with dramatically lower costs in South America. Brazil is ramping up. Argentina is waiting, Mexico is investing, and the countries buying beef will have choices. They will choose based on price, they will choose based on self-sufficiency. South Korea triggered the beef safeguard in July 2025. That means the exact same thing happened. Your quota got capped, your market got locked, you're watching this identical play run in every major market simultaneously. One tariff at a time, one quota at a time, one door at a time. You built your operation around open global demand. That demand is rewriting the rules in real time. To understand what is happening now, understand where you were 5 years ago. The Australian national herd was not just large, it was growing. Seasonal conditions were favorable across most regions. Processing capacity had expanded across every state. Queensland was producing record volumes. New South Wales was hitting benchmarks not seen since the early 2000s. Victoria had added 63,000 head of processing capacity in 3.5 years. The infrastructure was built. The herd was there. The world was buying. Everyone was making money. In 2025, Australia exported a record 1.545 million tons of beef. That is 15% higher than 2024. Exports went everywhere. The United States up 15% to 453,000 tons. China up 41% to 272,000 tons. South Korea setting new records. Japan holding at 257,000 tons. Canada surging 80% to 52,000 tons. You were feeding the world. Every processor ran at maximum capacity. Slaughter hit historic peaks not seen since 1978. The national herd stood at 31 million head. Cattle prices held firm at 700 to 750 cents per kilogram. The narrative was clear. Australian beef had never been stronger. That was the setup. Everything you built was constructed on the assumption of a herd that would remain large and available. The market would stay open. Demand would stay strong. Prices would hold or climb. You expanded operations. You held breeding females. You took on debt. You invested in infrastructure. And then in December 2025, China changed the rules entirely. Here's the precise mechanism. They created a global beef safeguard under WTO rules. What sounds like protection for developing economies is actually a weapon for strategic market closure. The safeguard allows any country to restrict imports if those imports cause serious injury to the domestic industry. China weaponized it with ice-cold precision. They did not ban Australian beef. They did something cleverer. They set a global quota at 2.7 million tons annually across all beef exporters combined, and allocated Australia only 205,000 tons of that total. Once you exceed that figure, the 55% duty automatically engages. It is mechanical. It is built into the system. It is automatic. The tariff is scheduled to last 3 years minimum. That is not temporary. This is structural policy. This is Beijing signaling that the era of cheap imports feeding Chinese consumers has ended. China is going to protect its own producers, even at the cost of higher prices for Chinese consumers, even at the cost of shutting out reliable suppliers like Australia, who built their entire model around selling to China. The timing matters enormously. Australia was at the absolute peak of its export cycle. The herd was large. Slaughter was elevated. Processors ran at maximum capacity. Beef flowed out at record rates. You made major decisions at that peak. You built operations at that peak. You borrowed capital at that peak, believing demand would sustain those borrowings indefinitely. Now, the largest market in your export strategy has become 55% more expensive to access. What was profitable is now marginal or negative. Your margin gets cut. Your debt becomes harder to service. But the tariff is only the immediate wound. The deeper wound is what it signals about your industry's future structure. You're not just losing a market. You're losing leverage. When you can export everywhere, prices stay firm because buyers bid for your supply. When markets close systematically, quotas tighten, tariffs stack, the entire negotiating position inverts. Suddenly, the buyer is not competing for your beef. The exporter is competing for the buyer's attention. This is not unique to China. South Korea triggered the beef safeguard in July 2025, months before China. The exact same thing occurred. Your quota got capped. Your exportability got restricted. You are watching this identical defensive strategy spread across every developed market that has the legal tools. Japan is watching. The European Union is watching. Even the United States, as its herd rebuilds, might use the same mechanism. Once one country pulls the trigger successfully, others follow. The real agenda underneath these announcements is invisible in official statements. It is not about protecting poor farmers in China or South Korea. It is about self-sufficiency and food security. It is about every major consuming economy deciding that relying on imports for critical protein is a security risk they cannot tolerate. China does not want to remain dependent on Australian beef. South Korea does not want Australian supply vulnerability. If a geopolitical conflict erupts, if shipping gets disrupted, if Australia closes supply for any reason, these countries want their own domestic producers meeting their own needs. So the strategy is clear. Restrict imports enough to make local production profitable, rebuild local herds, achieve self-sufficiency, protect yourself by closing the door on everyone else. You sit in the middle as the exporter. You get squeezed. You built your operation assuming open markets would remain open. You invested capital assuming export demand would sustain your herd size. You made breeding decisions based on export prices. Now, systematically, one market at a time, those assumptions are being withdrawn. The United States is still open. For now. The U.S. herd is at 70-year lows. U.S. production is collapsing. They need beef. They pay for it. Australian beef shipped 453,000 tons to America this year, the largest single market by volume. But the United States will not stay hungry forever. The U.S. herd rebuild has already started. Production will climb. Eventually, American farmers will want their government protecting American processors from imported beef competition. It is the same story every time. It is how this plays out when supply tightens. What you're watching is the end of an era where a country could grow more beef, process it, and find global buyers willing to pay premium prices. That era is closing. Every government is deciding that protein security is food, security is national security. Every major buyer is moving towards self-sufficiency. And every exporter caught in the middle is facing a choice: rebuild for a smaller market or hang on and hope doors reopen. They will not reopen. The doors are closing. Meanwhile, while the tariff was being implemented, something else was happening quietly. The Australian national herd was already declining. From a peak of 32 million head in 2013, the herd slipped to 30.2 million in 2024. In 2025, despite record slaughter and production, the herd fell to 29.5 million. The 2026 forecast is grim, another 3% decline to 28.6 million. By 2027, the herd could drop to 27 million. That is a 15% decline from the 2013 peak, accelerating. The reason is straightforward. You are slaughtering the breeding females. The female slaughter ratio averaged 52.8% in 2024-25. Historically, an FSR above 50% means the herd is in active liquidation. You are consuming the future to produce the present. In 2025, despite record cattle prices and strong demand signals, Australia slaughtered 9.28 million head. In 2026, that number is forecast to climb to 9.45 million, the highest rate since 1978. You're processing cattle faster than you are breeding them. The herd cannot sustain that. Here is what is happening in real time. China closes the market, collapsing global prices as volume seeks alternative outlets. As prices soften, the incentive to hold breeding females evaporates. Ranchers respond by liquidating breeding stock. Slaughter climbs. Herd size falls. Production peaks in 2026, then falls sharply in 2027 and 2028. Beef export volumes drop from record 1.545 million tons in 2025 to something lower in 2026 and significantly lower in 2027. The value of exports plummets from $19.8 billion in 2025-26 to $16.3 billion in 2026-27. That is an 18% drop in value in 1 year. The processors are fine. JBS Australia posted a 9.9% margin. JBS reported record global revenue of $86.2 billion. When cattle prices softened in 2023, supermarket prices barely moved. Coles and Woolworths maintained their margins. Processors maintained their margins. Across every level of the supply chain except the producer, the money held steady and grew. But the farmer was different. The average cash income for a specialist beef farm fell to $65,000 in 2023-24, a devastating 66% collapse in a single year. That was before the tariff. That was before China closed the door. So here is what comes next. The tariff is active now. Export volumes will adjust over the next 6 months as processors work out new market strategies. Some beef will be redirected to Canada, the UK, the Middle East. Prices in those markets will soften because they are absorbing volume that normally would have gone to China. Processor demand will soften. Cattle prices will weaken. The incentive to hold breeding females will collapse. Slaughter will climb in late 2026 and into 2027. The herd will contract faster. By 2027, you will have significantly fewer cattle on the market. Prices will be under permanent downward pressure. The government will call it a market correction. It is not. It is a coordinated effort by the world's largest beef buyers to dismantle the export-dependent model of Australian beef production. What nobody in Canberra wants to admit, Australia built an entire industry on the assumption that global markets would remain open and hungry. That assumption was always wrong. It was always fragile. But for 20 years, it held. Now it is breaking. The moment is closing. The markets that were open are shutting. The herd that was growing is shrinking. And every choice you made was made on the assumption of an era that is already ending. Here is what you need to understand about 2027. The Australian beef sector is entering a period of tightening supply. Slaughter is forecast to drop by 600,000 head in 2027 compared to 2026. That is the difference between capacity and overcapacity in your region. Processors will compete harder for cattle. Margins will compress. Some processors will consolidate. Some will close. The herd will be in rebuild mode, not by choice. That is good long term. It is bad short term. You will have fewer cattle to sell into a tight market. The timing is wrong. The cycle has inverted. Drop your state in the comments. Tell me how the China tariff landed on your operation. How many head are you running? What percentage was destined for China? What will this cost you in the next 12 months? I want the specifics from the ground. The herd is collapsing. The markets are closing. The farmers are the only ones bearing the cost.